trickle down economics doesn't work.
Whoa, hold on.
Game changing concept. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Michael Linden with me, who is a senior policy fellow at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And he was a former associate director at the White House Office of Management and Budget, and now working on a wonderful new campaign for families over billionaires. Michael, thank you for taking the little free time you have to be here.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to chat.
We have so much to chat about.
Yeah, we do. Oh,
yeah.
There's not much going on in the world.
No, it's very chill. It's very cool. Very easy breezy, beautiful. All right. What are we drinking? Feels important for this episode.
Okay. Well, I have to. So I went pretty standard with just like a Budweiser.
Classic.
I don't drink that much, to be totally honest with you.
Totally.
And I was hoping there would be a Yingling at the local, CVS or whatever.
Yeah.
But they had Budweiser, so I'm just going to stick with Budweiser.
Listen, sometimes you just have to go old school,
Just go old school.
Right. I am drinking what I drank last episode, which is Talea Beer Co. Sour Ale. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. All right. You're a man of many names and titles.
Yeah, so many titles.
So many titles. Why should we trust what you have to say? Tell us a little about you.
Well, why should you trust what I have to say? Great question. Who can trust anything these days? So let me just say my background, and then people should decide for themselves whether they think it's worth trusting me. I have been working in Washington for about 20 years. I've worked on economic policy, tax and budget in particular, in both Congress, in the Senate, in the White House, and at think tanks and advocacy groups. My perspective, just to be very upfront, I come from a perspective of, what's good for low and moderate income people is what's good for the country. Mm-hmm. And obviously, tax and budget I tell people I do tax and budget and their eyes glaze over, which I understand. But underneath everything that people care about, whether you care about, keeping your healthcare costs down, or you care about climate change, or you care about civil rights, underneath all of that is some kind of tax and budget issue. And that's part of the reason I like working on these issues, because it's so direct in people's lives.
Absolutely. A lot of the policy talk and executive orders and stuff don't feel sometimes that direct and of an impact. This is policy impacting lives. So
100%. It's everything from, and actually to connect it to what's happening right now in the world.
Yeah.
It's everything from children being able to go get a decent start in life at Head Start, to somebody trying, using a community health center for their basic health needs, to families using food stamps to make sure that their kids don't go hungry tonight. Right. Those are all parts of the federal budget. Those are all things that directly come from choices that we make. And, when those choices are good, people's lives can get a little bit easier. When those choices are bad, people's lives can get a lot harder.
Yeah. And let's talk about some of those choices.
Yes.
Some bad choices. Yeah. I would say that Trump has really taken to his apprentice roots this second time around, with everyone being, you're fired. So
yeah.
I would love to kind of structure this into two parts. One, you have a lot of experience being an OMB official, right? Which is generally something that is not supposed to be in the news that much, yet it is taken a forefront. And then there's also a budget proposal going on in Congress, and that's getting a lot of media attention as well, and that's very important. Which one you want to do first?
They're connected, honestly, Emily. They're connected. These things are not different. These are both what's happening in the administration with all these firings and, illegal cuts to funding, are also part of the same overall picture that, there's an argument that there's not enough money We don't have enough money to go around. We can't afford to make sure poor kids have food or that people have health care because there's not enough money, but there's always enough money for more tax cuts for billionaires. And that is why these things are connected, because that is underlying both of these things, is this idea that we should just be cutting taxes for very wealthy people and everybody else should pick up the tab.
Yeah. For people who listen, this is a hotly contested topic. My 2 cents, trickle down economics doesn't work.
Whoa, hold on.
Game changing concept.
Emily, hold on a second.
I know.
I just want to say that like 40 years of experience would agree with you. Yes.
Thank you.
But this time, maybe it'll be different.
Maybe. You know what they say?
It's never worked.
Try again. Try.
It's never worked before, but this time.
This time, 40th year's the charm is what they say.
That's right. That's right. I mean, we joke and it's darkly funny, but it is a little bit ridiculous because this has been tried so many times, and making it even more ridiculous is the American people don't think it's going to work. It's not. There's not some big clamoring for more tax cuts for billionaires and corporations. This is a cross-partisan, right? Like you have Democrats don't want to do this, Republican voters don't want to do this, independent voters don't want to do this. Nobody wants to cut taxes for the super wealthy and make everybody else pay for it. But somehow here we are.
Right.
Yeah,
all right.
That's right.
Let's dive into it.
Okay.
So from what I have seen, once again, we are back in deja vu. The House and the Senate are butting heads, even though pretending like they're not going to, but they both have different opinions on things. And one of that being the budget, right? So the House is currently just, I think, proposed a 4.5 trillion cuts, right? Deficit.
Yes, that's right.
That's right. Please go more.
No. I mean, the way to think about what the House is doing, the simple way to think about it is they want to spend $4.5 trillion on tax cuts. Right. Okay. So on the one hand, they want to take $4.5 trillion and spend it on tax cuts. Most of those tax cuts go to the rich. Not every single penny, but most of it goes to the rich. And the average tax cut for somebody in the top 0.1% is going to be something like $250,000 a year. Like it's an enormous amount of money Like people could, a family of 8 could live on that comfortably. So one thing they want to do is spend $4.5 trillion on these tax cuts. Then they want to partially pay for that by cutting $1 trillion from Medicaid, a couple of $100 billion from food stamps, a couple of $100 billion from an assortment of other services and protections, things like maybe higher education Pell Grants. It could be school lunch and school breakfast. We don't actually have the specifics yet. They haven't gone line by line, but we kind of know the categories of where they're going to try to get this from.
And this is over the next decade so people are aware as well.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. It's these 10-year numbers, which can sometimes be a little bit, they can be confusing. It's just the way that by convention, it's the way that we talk about budget numbers at the federal level as we talk about them over 10 years. But the way to think about it, is a very wealthy person will end up with a very large tax cut every year, $250,000 a year, every year. Whereas a low income or moderate income person might lose their health care forever, right? That's the kind of trade-off that we're talking about here. And the cuts that they are proposing to Medicaid are very large. They are not nibbling around the edges. This is millions of people, maybe tens of millions of people will lose their coverage. 70 million Americans get their health care through Medicaid. If you try to cut that by 1/6, a lot of people are going to lose their health insurance. So that's the way to think about this budget. A huge amount of spending on tax cuts paid for by cuts to basic things that most Americans rely on.
And for people who think that if you're one of the fortunate ones to get health insurance through your company, right? But you happen to live in a rural area where a lot of people rely on Medicare and Medicaid.
Yeah.
A lot of that money that pays for those services is paid for by this federal government money.
That's
so
right.
In turn, this directly impacts probably the access of care that you would be able to receive as well.
Absolutely right. There's no world where we could cut 10 million people off of healthcare and have that not ripple outwards to everybody else, right? We are all worse off in a lot of different ways when millions of people don't have healthcare anymore. And it's worth remembering who we're talking about here, right? Medicaid covers a lot of children, a lot of senior citizens, and a lot of people with disabilities. And it's not super generous. That's the thing. If you talk to folks who rely on Medicaid, first of all, they'll tell you they need it. It's super critical to their lives, but nobody thinks like, oh, it's just generously paying out benefits left and right. That is not the experience that people have. So this idea that we could painlessly cut a sixth from it is just incredibly wrong. And you make a great point, which is a ton of rural hospitals depend largely on Medicaid payments. That will be a huge impact. More people without insurance means we are all poorer. And look, the economic impact is devastating. Also, just like morally, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? Taking poor people's healthcare away so that rich people can have another tax cut. It sounds like I'm making it up. I mean, this gets to your question to begin with. Why should people trust me?
It sounds like the Hunger Games.
It sounds so cartoonishly evil that people don't believe me when I tell them that's what's actually happening. But it is actually what's happening.
Yeah. And I just saw like an incredible quote that was like, if someone tells you it's raining outside and then someone else tells you it's dry, it's not your job to believe one or the other. It's your job to go look out the window and see what's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
People are going to tell you lots of stuff, but there is truth that can be found. You can't just accept because of, unfortunately, the world we live in. And I am a talking head, but I try so hard to be factually accurate, right? People are just going to share shit and they're going to share it all the time. And no one's really holding people accountable. And even the major media organizations, right? Like, there's just so much propaganda coming at people. Yes. Look at the facts, and this is a fact. If this passes, we are taking away healthcare from the neediest and the poorest of people, and everyone gets fucked.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And look, to connect it to these other cuts that are happening through Musk's efforts, whatever you want to call them, they are cutting things or trying to cut things through an extra congressional process, like basically doing it outside of the legislative process, which is illegal, by the way. Just it's always useful to remember that that's actually illegal, but they're doing it that way in part because they know it would be so unpopular to cut Head Start or community health centers or veterans benefits or support to tribes around the country or public schools, which are all things they have cut or gotten in the way of the funding for. They know that Congress would never pass those. Even this Congress would never pass those. So they are doing it illegally so that they can convince the super right-wing congressman to vote for a bigger tax cut. That's what's happening here. And right. It's so hard we don't have to convince people that when it's raining, they should wear an umbrella. They should get an umbrella to use your analogy. We have to convince people it actually is raining. Like they should put their hands out the window and feel it is raining. And you're absolutely right. They're going to hear a ton of misinformation. Oh, this is about fraud, or this is about efficiency, or this is just about making sure that illegal aliens don't get benefits. Like there's all sorts of misinformation. That's not what's happening here. None of that's what's happening here. What's happening is they want to spend an enormous amount of money on tax cuts for the rich, and they want to pay for it by making sure that everybody else has less.
Awesome.
I
Wonderful.
mean, it's baffling and it's not popular, right? Like the thing that I try to remind myself in my moments of like, I can't believe we're debating about, we're not even debating this,
Yeah.
is, this is not where where most Americans are. Most Americans, regardless of their political affiliations or their leanings, do not think that rich people need another tax cut. And they do not think that Medicaid is too generous or rife with fraud or anything like that. And so I'm hoping that the reality of millions of Americans' actual lives will win out here.
Hoping.
I hope.
Hoping. So this is another big part of what people say versus what actually happens. And one of those things being is that Trump recently said that in this budget, they're not going to cut Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security or anything like that. Right. But in order to cut the amount for the tax cuts of which they want to pass, it would be, from what I understand, near impossible.
Yeah. I'm going to go further and say it's impossible. So, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but like the piece of legislation that the House is currently considering, it's a framework. So it's a multi-step process. So it's not like they're about to pass it and it's going to become law tomorrow. It's a multi-step process. The step they're on now is an early step, but the step they're on now lays out this framework of what the final legislation will actually be. And it gives instructions by committee on what they have to do, right, in order to finally make this piece of legislation. And if they don't meet those instructions, then they can't pass the bill in the end. So we know that the final bill will meet these basic instructions. So this is a lot of wind up, but here's the pitch. The instructions include $880 billion of cuts to a committee called Energy and Commerce. What is the only thing in Energy and Commerce's jurisdiction that could have that level of cuts? Medicaid. Period. Full stop. No bullshit. Which means that it cannot both be true that they are not cutting Medicaid and they are going to do $880 billion of cuts in this committee. One of those things is not true. The legislation says $880 billion of cuts in Energy and Commerce, which is how we know for a fact that they will be cutting Medicaid. And that's why, look, I'm glad that Trump said we're not going to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's right. We shouldn't be cutting those things. But words are one thing, actions are another. And the bill that they are currently considering would force cuts to Medicaid, period, full stop.
Thank you for clarifying that. And
I bet that was more than your listeners ever wanted to know about legislative procedure and committee jurisdiction.
I love legislative procedure. I am such a nerd when it comes to that stuff. And because it's my podcast, I can decide how much I want to include it. I want to include it all. So
okay, great. Listen, I'm happy to go into more detail about reconciliation, but that's not actually the key thing here.
Yeah, it's hard to make reconciliation sexy, but if we could do it, we could do it on bureaucracy.
That's right.
So part of this that I have found a little bit confusing is I've been seeing that these tax cuts, some of them are already in existence and they're from 2017.
Yeah.
And there are some new ones. Could you give the breakdown on this?
Yes, that's a great question. So just to step back for a minute, in 2017, when Donald Trump was president the first time, the most significant piece of legislation that he signed before COVID was a, spoiler alert, giant tax cut mostly for rich people, right? It was called the Orwellian name of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It didn't create any jobs. It didn't raise wages. It didn't trickle down, but it was a giant tax cut. There were some big pieces of that I'll just quickly run through. One of the biggest pieces of that was a giant cut to the corporate tax rate. So the corporate tax rate went down by about 40%. So it was 30. Yeah, huge, massive corporate tax cut, trillions of dollars worth of corporate tax cuts. And some of the biggest companies in America and globally, frankly, got billions of dollars in tax benefits. That was a big chunk of it. And then there was a series of tax cuts that mainly affected high-income Americans, and then some affected low and moderate-income Americans, but in complicated ways. Some people ended up a little bit better off, but not very much better off, but a little bit. Some people ended up a little bit worse off, and a lot of people just saw no change. Their taxes didn't really change that much. But at the very top, you had a lower top marginal tax rate, a lower top tax rate. You had some new deductions that only went, or that disproportionately went, to rich people. And you had a big cut in the estate tax, which is the tax that is paid only by super rich people when they die and they pass their estates on to heirs. So you had all of those things. Now, those things actually expire this year. Why do they expire? We're going to have to use the word reconciliation again. The short answer is that the special legislative procedure that they used then to pass that bill, which they're trying to use again now, has some special rules that were essentially forced them to have it expire, parts of it expire. And so we're sitting at this moment where some of those tax cuts will expire if they don't do anything. Most of those tax cuts benefit people at the very top, but not every single one of them. And then, as you said, Emily, like, there is some discussion of additional tax cuts on top of the existing ones, like maybe even a lower corporate tax rate, maybe some new tax cuts on different kinds of income, like capital income, or there is this idea of no tax on tips. There's things like that. But the meat of this is renewing all of these tax cuts that were mostly for people at the very top, which means, by the way, that for like 95% of Americans, it's going to be no different. Like, they're not even going to feel anything. There's not going to be any change for most people, except they might lose their health insurance.
Perfect. Great. So if this is the right, like, let's say, like, irregardless of the potential new tax cuts, when Biden was president, right, and these went through the system because he couldn't change them because they were in their law, did that affect the budget at all?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we as a country, at the federal level, we collect way less in taxes than we used to because of all these tax cuts. And we as a country, we collect much less in taxes than almost any other country that is sort of similar to us economically, Canada or the UK or any of the European countries or Japan or Australia. We are very low tax, relatively speaking, to these other countries. And a big reason, it's not the only reason, but a big reason is because we've been cutting taxes mostly for rich people for a long time. And, 2017 was just the latest in a long series of tax cuts that have disproportionately benefited people at the very top. And then you wonder why we look around and we think, why does it always feel like there's never enough money to invest in, like, our schools or our hospitals or our roads or on bridges, or, to make sure that planes aren't falling out of the sky, and make sure that food is safe, and make sure that people have healthcare? Why does it always feel like there's not enough to go around in this extremely wealthy country of ours? And the answer is because we have been spending trillions of dollars over the last 25 years on tax cuts, mostly for the rich and corporations. And so, yeah, if we didn't do that, we would have a lot more revenue that we could invest in all the things that people want and need: lower housing costs, lower childcare costs, lower healthcare costs. But we don't do that because the budget feels really tight. Everything feels really scarce. But it's because we spend all of our money on tax cuts for rich people.
Do you want to know who's getting more money? The Department of Defense.
It's true. They have a bigger budget than they used to. That is true.
Uh-huh.
I will say this, though. I will say that this is maybe where I'm a little bit at odds with some of my friends. We do spend a lot of money on defense, no question about it. We spend more on defense than the next 10 countries combined in the world.
Go big or go home. It's the American way.
Yeah, I can see the argument for it in a lot of respects.
Yeah.
I will say, though, as a share of our national income, we actually spend less today than we have in the past. We spend more in kind of inflation-adjusted dollars but we spend less as a share of our national income because we as a country, we have become very wealthy, right? And even more wealthy over time. But the benefits of that growth have been so concentrated among the very, very top that it doesn't feel that way to a lot of people. But as a share of our total national income, we're actually not spending, a lot more on defense than we used to. So
that's a great fact.
Which is not to say that we couldn't find savings there, to be clear. I think there are savings to be had there.
Totally.
But, the real change in our policy over the last 25 years in terms of why things feel so tight is the tax side, even more than the spending side, even more than defense.
That's a very insightful fact that I think is not talked about a lot. And I just love shitting on the military industrial complex,
listen, I don't, it's not that I don't mean to defend, like I would never defend.
No, you're not, but you're providing
every dollar, right?
You're providing important insight to the situation and helping us redirect where our focus and our anger should be. And that is an extremely valuable thing to provide.
It is important to me. Look, people can look at any part of the budget, genuinely any part of the budget, and say, I think we should spend more or less, on this or that. And I think that's worthwhile. That's was part of our job when I was working at OMB, was to do exactly that, go through line by line and try to figure out, should we be spending more? Should we be spending less? And certainly there is waste in the government. There's no question. It's not by any means perfect. But Head Start is not wasteful, and Medicaid is not wasteful, and Social Security is rife with fraud. Like those are lies. Those are just lies, and I'm going to call them lies. The place where there's the most waste, fraud, and abuse is, I'm going to be a broken record here, the tax code. We spend so much money on special subsidies to different industries or corporations or certain kinds of income that we think is better than wages for some reason. And you think I'm joking, but it's genuinely true. If you make your money by selling, stocks and businesses and art, you actually pay a lower tax rate on that income than if you make your money by waiting tables or driving a garbage truck or being a nurse. Like that's bananas.
That's dumb. That's
crazy. It's dumb. It's really dumb.
Yeah.
And that's where the waste is. That's where the fraud is.
And thank God that we have a multi-billionaire, the one cutting out all the waste. So
I don't even know. It's it's so dystopian.
Yeah.
That we've entrusted the literal richest person in the history of the planet. I mean, that part may not be true. I don't know. Is he richer than King Tut? I don't know, but he's really rich.
It's insane.
And we've entrusted him with the task of deciding whether or not somebody's food stamps counts as waste. I don't know. That doesn't seem right to me.
I would agree with you. So let's dive into it. Let's talk a little bit about what Doge has been cutting, and then we're going to dive into the OMB. But let's start with Doge. A lot of this shit's legal, which we've talked about and talked about in previous episodes, right? And we've seen Elon Musk, we've seen Trump, and we've seen JD Vance already set the stage to try to claim that any type of legal pushback is unconstitutional, which is not the case, right?
Yeah, I don't even know what to say about that. I don't know what to say about that. It's bananas. I mean, up until 6 weeks ago, everybody would have agreed the power of the purse is with Congress. That is a well-established constitutional principle. Congress decides what gets spent, not the president. And look, I can tell you at my time at OMB, we spent a ton of time thinking about how are Congress gave us this money to do a specific purpose. We have to execute that purpose. Of course, there is some wiggle room within those purposes, right? Congress gave us money to build highways. Okay, well, that's a broad purpose. How do we figure out the best way to build highways? That's fair. That's fair game. What's not fair game is to just be Congress gave us money to build highways. We're just not going to build any highways. That's illegal. That's clearly illegal and unconstitutional. And it hurts a lot of people. And like, that's the other thing. I mean, I wish it was enough for us to just say it's illegal and unconstitutional. That should be enough. I guess it isn't, but it hurts a lot of people. There are families who weren't sure whether their Head Start centers were going to be open. I don't know how you justify that. These are people who are working really hard, trying to make ends meet. They need an affordable place and a safe place for their kids to go during the day. I don't know how you defend, cutting off funding to Head Start. I don't know. It's baffling to me.
Yeah, it's immoral.
It's immoral. It's both immoral. It's backwards economically. It's politically unpopular, and it's unconstitutional. So that's like the rare, what is
trifecta.
That? Quadfecta.
Yeah, quadfecta, yeah, exactly. Whatever it is. You've hit everything you need to hit.
Yeah, but other than that, it seems fine.
My God, it's fucking ridiculous. So one of these things, right, and that I find really interesting is, let's talk about the OMB and Russel Vought.
Yeah.
When I have like 5 more minutes to my name, I want to go through Project 2025, and I want to go through and see what they have done and see what they're going to do next. Because for the people that are like, no, it's just an idea, it's never going to happen, they're not associated. Take a goddamn look. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, he literally wrote the chapter on the executive office of the president. Mm-hmm. Russel Vought wrote that chapter in Project 2025.
And now here we are. Yeah. So let's talk about the Office of Management and Budget, sure, because it is not something that you hear about every day, yet it's not. Right? But it is now a very important part of what's going on.
Yeah, indeed.
What did you do? What is it for?
Yeah, totally fair. So OMB is a really interesting place. And it sits within the executive office of the president. So when I worked there, I was a White House staffer, right? I had a White House badge. I worked on the White House campus. But it also, in addition to being in the executive office of the president, it's also essentially its own little agency that has its own director who's Senate confirmed. And when I was there, it was the incredible Shalonda Young, who I could spend an entire separate podcast singing the praises of, because she is an absolutely incredible human being, who I was very lucky to work for and learn from. In this case, it's Russel Vought, who is not that. So OMB has this interesting purpose where it is part of the executive office of the president, it's part of the White House, but it also serves as a kind of overseer and conduit to the agencies on budget and program. So one of the core functions of OMB is to put together the president's budget proposal every year. And that budget proposal does not immediately become law by any means. We have a very strange budget process in this country, but the president's budget is a starting point, but it's an important starting point. And so one of the tasks of OMB is to put that budget proposal together, but then other tasks are to oversee the agencies as they go about the task of spending the money that Congress has appropriated them to spend. So OMB asks for spend plans. They ask to make sure that they are complying with the law and with the appropriate regulations, that they're spending the money on an appropriate pace, not too slow, but also not too fast, right? Because you can't spend, again, who knows we're in a brave new world, but at least when I was there, you both couldn't spend money you didn't have, right? But you also had to spend the money you did have, right? Those were the kind of twin pillars. You had to be between those two things. And that was OMB's job. Part of their job was to make sure that those things were happening appropriate with the law. Then OMB also has a whole management function, making sure that, the approach to federal employees was really effective and smart. That our digital and cyber strategies were being carried out effectively. And then OMB also has the function of overseeing most major regulations. So every major regulation comes through OMB.
I had no idea until the executive order that just happened.
Yeah.
Had no idea.
Almost all major regulations come through OMB. So it was fun. I'll be honest with you, exhausting, but a fun place to work because you really get to see into every element of the federal government, and your job there is to help make things work well. We didn't succeed every single day, but
who does?
Who does, right? But that's really the major job. And then the OMB director, who oversees all of that, also serves usually as a core member of the president's economic team, right? Advising the president on all manner of economic issues. And I'll say one more thing is a long answer to a simple question. In general, OMB is also usually the sort of point person, the point agency on negotiations with Congress about appropriations and budget issues. So when I was there, for example, I had the honor, privilege, and sad duty of being one of the 4 administration officials negotiating over the debt limit. You might remember that from 2023.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that was fun.
I can't believe you made it out alive. I'm so glad
I made it out.
Crazy.
A husk of a man. No, it was an interesting. I mean, look, it was really. I've never worked so hard in my life. I mean, I slept so little.
72 hours straight.
It was for weeks. We were basically just negotiating in these marathon sessions.
Oh God.
But again, could not be more grateful to have had the opportunity to work with Shalanda, who really, just basically helped carry that team. And there were other people, Louisa Terrell and Steve Ricchetti were also just incredible. But it was a front row seat to a very high stakes negotiation. And that's the kind of thing that OMB often is in the middle of.
I don't envy you, but I thank you for your service.
Some other time I will tell you some of the best stories from that experience.
Off the record.
Yeah. And there were some doozies.
Oh my God, I can only imagine. Crazy. Okay. What are your initial thoughts on what Russell has turned the OMB into?
Well, I mean, none of them are good. Look, I have a lot of complicated thoughts in many ways, because on the one hand, from big picture stepping back, I just fundamentally disagree with him on the role that the federal government should be playing in people's lives. I believe that the federal government needs to be on the side of low and moderate income people. We have a system in our country, for better or for worse, that is very often stacked against low and moderate income people for a range of reasons and a range of ways. And very wealthy people have so much power and influence so often that the only, not the only, but one of the only effective checks on that kind of power can be the public sector, the federal government, where people come together as a collective and say, no, you rich people don't just get to decide everything for everybody. And Vought's perspective seems to be that the government should just get out of the way and let might make right. And the might is whoever's the richest, whoever has the most money, whoever's got the latest, ear of the president or biggest corporation. And I don't believe that. I think that's wrong. And I think it's wrong economically. I think it's wrong morally. So that's very hard to swallow. I also think it's a dereliction of duty to cede the functions of the Office of Management and Budget to an unelected, non-Senate confirmed billionaire who nobody voted for. At least Vought is Senate confirmed. I wouldn't have voted. I wouldn't have voted to confirm him, but at the very least, there's some Democratic accountability there, at least in theory. Musk is nothing, nobody. Why does he get to make these decisions, and who's holding him accountable? And it's shameful that Russel Vought would just cede that authority to an unelected billionaire. And then wrapped up in all of this is that I worked with an incredible array of very dedicated public servants who are career civil servants who woke up every morning and worked very hard every day on behalf of the American people, mostly in obscurity and for far less money than they could make in the private sector, because they believe in the function of a functioning government, regardless of who was in charge of that government, right? They took their role very seriously as nonpartisan experts whose job was to help execute the president's priorities within the boundaries of the law. And these people that I worked with, Emily, are wonderful. They are wonderful people who worked very hard. I didn't always agree with them. There were times when we would butt heads, but they were public servants in the best sense of the word. And I do not like that Russ Vought is demeaning them and undermining them and calling them, names and firing people that do not deserve it. I think it's wrong. And it's hard for me personally, because I know these people and I know that they put their heart and soul in serving the American people, and they don't deserve this.
Yeah, I can only imagine what it's like to be watching from the outside and how frustrating that is. And public servants don't do it for, they don't do it for the money. They don't
do it for the money.
Certainly don't do it for the money. They don't do it for the recognition, right?
That's right.
People who are public servants have done it for decades and decades and decades, and it's because they love it and they believe in the country and they believe in the Constitution.
Right. And I have to say, look, I had my own little narrow experience, and it's not like I worked with every federal employee all over the country. And there are people all over the country. It's not just in Washington, I should say. But at least in my little corner of the world, these folks get to the office before everybody and they leave after everybody. They were working so hard. They worked their butts off on behalf of the American people. And it's, when you combine the attacks on them with the fact that they are carrying out a set of policies that are going to harm low-income parents and children and people who are really struggling every day, it's hard. It's hard to wrap your mind around this. So many people are going to get harmed here, and it's for what? So that Elon Musk can have another tax cut, I guess. It's terrible.
Don't forget, Elon Musk, a lot of his companies have federal governments and contracts. Yeah, huge federal contracts, right?
Huge contracts across many of his companies. And notably, none of those have been put under review. And in fact, instead of being put under review, he's fired a bunch of the people who have been overseeing some of those contracts and conducted reasonable oversight over some of those contracts.
Yeah, it's blatant favoritism and corruption, and it should concern everyone.
It absolutely should.
It should concern everyone.
It is not good for anybody for there to be this.
It's good for Elon Musk.
It's good for him. It's good for him for sure. And I guess if you are part of the billionaire class and you just think, well, who's going to hold us accountable, right? Like if we hollowed out the government, there's no more labor unions, not no more, but the labor unions have been dramatically weakened. Congress doesn't seem to care. Will the Supreme Court step in? Who knows? Maybe you think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you have a functioning government as long as you get yours. And I think that's terrible for the 99%, but it may be okay for the very top.
Yeah, I have news for all of the people who think that Trump is doing these things in your interest. If you were not on the dais while he was inaugurated, you're not one of those people.
You're not, yeah. And I will say, I don't blame, look, I don't blame people for being frustrated
No,
broadly,
absolutely.
right? I don't blame people for wanting their government to give them a little bit more breathing room and to do a little bit more on their behalf. I think that's a fair expectation. I think that's exactly what we should be asking of our government. That's not what's happening here. It's the opposite. And if anything, it's just a betrayal. It's a betrayal of those voters who, for whatever reason, decided they were willing to try again with this guy. But he's betraying those same people.
Yeah. And like I said, and I'll probably say this on every podcast episode until something changes, the price of eggs has not gone down.
No, it hasn't. No, it hasn't.
The fucking bird flu, people. Anyways,
the price of eggs hasn't gone down.
It's fine.
Listen, the rent hasn't gone down.
Yeah.
Childcare costs have not gone down. Your healthcare costs have not gone down. And
inflation just went up again. So
and not to be a broken record, but if they pass this budget bill to take it all the way back to the beginning here, a lot of people's healthcare costs are going to go up. Their grocery costs are going to go up. Their housing costs, their energy costs are going to go up. It's
detrimental.
It's incredible. It's hard to describe.
It's actually hard to fathom.
It's hard to fathom.
And you made an interesting point, which I think is really important. I don't think you could meet any person who would not agree on some level that there's absolutely waste within the government, right? In government spending. Absolutely. We just have different opinions on how to root it out and get there, right? But you were in a really interesting perspective because, you were in the budgets, right? You were looking at all this stuff. Putting tax policy aside, what do you think are the biggest, subscribers to this waste? And what do you think could actively be cut?
Yeah. So just to, put us all in context, right? So the federal budget it's big, no question about it. It's not, people use big numbers because they are big numbers, but we're a big country with a lot of people in it. But the budget really, there's like 4 things in the budget that make up almost 3/4 of all spending, right? Just 4 things: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense. Those 4 things, basically 3/4 of all spending. Everything else is pretty small, frankly, by comparison. Even the biggest things that are not that huge. So the question is, to start, is there a lot of waste in those 4 things? I would say there's not much waste at all in Social Security. If anything, Social Security is not generous enough for a lot of people. In the program, it does not have a lot of overhead. It does not, and if you ask a senior citizen, or somebody who's disabled who receives Social Security benefits, do you think that it's, would you be happier if they cut people answering the phones and, helping to process your claims? I think they'd say no. It's not exactly super fast service now. So not much waste in Social Security. We already talked about Medicaid. I really don't think there's very much waste in Medicaid. It's a very spare program. We can argue maybe states could take up more of the slack. So not much in Medicaid. Medicare is interesting because the benefits to beneficiaries, I think, are not particularly wasteful. Again, I think you could ask Medicare recipients, I think they'd tell you that they're very grateful for Medicare and they are happy with it. I don't think they would tell you it's too generous. That said, we do spend a bunch of money on Medicare that mainly goes to private health insurance companies through a program called Medicare Advantage. And that is a place where I feel like we could save money without harming beneficiaries by squeezing out some of the excess profits that go to insurance companies. Actually, another good example is pharmaceutical companies, where we pay exorbitant prices for pharmaceutical drugs through Medicare. We've started to squeeze some of that down under President Biden, but there's a lot more we could do there. So there's some waste there. And then there's defense. And look, yes, there's definitely waste in defense. No question. But one of the things that I learned, and this is partly what I think gets people frustrated, is that there's almost nothing in the federal budget that doesn't have a champion somewhere in Congress, because we're a democracy, or at least in theory. And there are things and defense is a great example of this, because there are things in the defense budget that the Pentagon themselves do not want. They'll say, we don't need that. We don't need that particular weapon system, but we do it anyway because there's a congressional champion, because maybe that weapon system is built in their district. And for that congressional member, that weapon system is jobs. And if you're a person who works in that factory, that's pretty important. So one of the things I really did learn in government in OMB is, like, it's one thing to find true fraud, which we should absolutely root out everywhere we find it. Fraud is different. It's much less fraud than people think, but there is some. But waste is very much in the eye of the beholder. And there's definitely stuff that I would happily cut from the budget that plenty of Republicans would say, oh, no, that's not what we meant by waste, because that's something that affects my district. And frankly, in a democracy, we're going to have some of that. Now, the problem we have is that apparently we're sliding into non-democracy. And then I guess Elon Musk gets to decide what's wasteful and what's not. And that's a real problem.
And that's scary.
It's really scary.
Any response to all the claims about all the fraud that's going on in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid?
100% bullshit.
Perfect.
It's just I'm not saying that there's no fraud anywhere. Like, there is.
Fraud happens everywhere.
Fraud happens.
Like, people suck, and sometimes it happens.
Fraud happens, and we should absolutely root it out. But for Elon Musk to claim that there's millions of people on Social Security who are dead or 150 years old or who are non-citizens here illegally, that is not true. That is frankly and flatly false. And it's a cover for when they cut people's benefits. And that's what I really worried about. And people say to me, I say that sometimes, and people say, no, they'll never cut Social Security. It's too popular. They cut veterans benefits. They cut people serving veterans. They fired a bunch of people serving America's veterans. If that's not incredibly unpopular, I don't know what is. And if they have no accountability, if they have no way to be held to account, they could absolutely do things that are super unpopular, like cutting people's benefits. Especially if they're going to try to fight against the legal system. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So yes, no, it is not the case at all that there's a ton of fraud in Social Security or Medicaid. Or food stamps. And to the degree that there is, by the way, food stamps is an interesting example, because there is fraud in food stamps, but it's not beneficiaries stealing from the government. It's scammers stealing from beneficiaries. One of the most common frauds in food stamps is something called card skimming, where somebody puts a device on because the way that we deliver these benefits is through an electronic benefits card. It looks like a credit card, right? And so they put these card skimmers in the credit card machines, and they steal the benefits from the card. And then the person goes, the family goes to use the card the next time, and the money's out. And they're like, well, how is that possible? How is it that the money's been out? Because the money's been stolen. So that's not fraud on the taxpayer. That's fraud on the poor family who's just trying to make ends meet. And I'll tell you what doesn't solve that problem. Cutting food stamps doesn't solve that problem. Especially not with egg prices these days. No, that's right. That's right. All right, Michael, this has been so incredibly informative. Thank you so much for doing this. Is there anything last comments you'd like to say? Anything we didn't touch on? I mean, we touched on a lot. This was really fun. I have only drunk about half of my beer, which just shows you what a lightweight I am. I don't know. I really appreciate the chance to chat about all this. I really want people to know what's happening in Washington. I think it's really important. And, I think it is not inevitable. That's the other thing I would say. It's not inevitable. They have a super narrow majority in the House. If enough people speak up, they will not be able to do some of these things. And so that's sort of the thought I'll leave you with.
It's a good thought. People call your representatives. So, Michael, thank you so much. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.